we are proud to be sponsored by our friends at Oracle NetSuite. Learn how to turbocharge your growth today at netsuite.com/legends. Rolling Stone calls our guest today, Paul Austin, quote, the first online LSD microdosing coach, end quote. How's that for a niche down? Now, this is a mind-altering episode of Legends and Losers. This is a very different conversation. It will challenge the way you think about psychedelic drugs and the role of drugs in business. So we tackle how mind-expanding drugs are a hot new business trend, psychedelic drugs in the start of Silicon Valley, and how Paul Austin became the category king of LSD microdosing. All right. The Ramon said, hey ho, let's go. And that's what we're going to do. Legends and Losers has been called a magical mystery tour of conversation. And we are going to go on a magical mystery tour today, my friends. One of our longtime listeners, lawyer Scott Athan, says, quote, most podcasts are BS interview shows featuring a host and a guest who each roll through their talking points without really having a dialogue. Christopher Lochhead can't stop chasing zebras down rabbit holes long enough to have talking points. And that's the beauty of it. Legends and Losers is like a conversation among friends, but the friends are some of the most amazing people in the world, end quote. And Scott, thank you for that wonderful iTunes review. And you summed up what we're trying to do here on Legends and Losers. And this conversation with Paul is like none other. It may be out there for some people. I would encourage you to move aside any preconceived notions you have and just listen to this conversation. I will admit to you, this is an out there conversation for me, but I wanted to have it. It's a big trend in the tech industry and in business and in society. And Paul and I have an incredible conversation about the role of LSD. Now, before we get to Paul, I'd love for you to check out netsuite.com/legends. And there you'll be able to download your free guide to crushing the 5 barriers to growth. And NetSuite is offering Legends and Losers listeners an opportunity to book an hour-long dialogue discussion with a NetSuite growth expert in your industry. Now, Investopedia says that money management and fatigue are 2 of the biggest challenges facing growing businesses. And in many cases, that can be attributed by not being on the right platform for running your business. And so NetSuite is purpose-built to help you run every aspect of your business and to grow with you from the garage to the IPO and beyond. NetSuite handles orders, sales, cash flow, customer information, finance, inventory, HR, and more. And you can stay up to date with emerging tax laws, which I know is incredibly important, audit requirements, financial reporting, consolidation, and new accounting standards like ASC 606. I've been reading about that one late at night. NetSuite is a complete business management system in the cloud that scales with you, giving you the power to drive the bus as opposed to be under the bus from your browser and your smartphone anywhere you can connect in the world. Over 40,000 growing businesses are built on top of NetSuite. NetSuite is the platform for growth. It's time to get real about growth. It's time to get growing. Check out netsuite.com/legends. Now, Paul is the founder of an outfit called The Third Wave, and you can find him at The Third Wave, all one word, .co. He explores pragmatic ways to enhance cultural conversation around psychedelic drugs, focusing on the interaction or the intersection of science, psychedelics, and personal self-optimization. He's a social entrepreneur and psychedelic advocate. He's been in the SF Gate. He's been on Quartz. He's been in Business Insider, WebMD, the Financial Times, New York Magazine, and Rolling Stone. And now here he is, Paul, on Legends and Losers.
Right. And there's a lot of things going on at Stanford University, particularly with the design and engineering school. And so you have this really interesting relationship between psychedelic use and the birth of the computer revolution in the mid-60s, where you had a lot of the initial engineers who were working on projects who also went to Stanford and were involved in the LSD experiments that were going on there. So there's a guy, the godfather of microdosing, Dr. Jim Fadiman, who was on the Tim Ferriss podcast right before that Rolling Stone article came out. And so that's what kicked it off. And Jim did research in 1966 with LSD that showed a relationship between moderate dose LSD use and breakthroughs in creativity and problem solving. And so he brought in engineers and other people from that era in the mid 60s. And that really helped to inform the start of Silicon Valley. And so then if we trace it a little bit more, we get into the 70s. And of course, Steve Jobs in his biography, a recent biography, said LSD was one of the most important things that he's ever done, the 3 most important things that he's ever done. So there's this really interesting relationship between psychedelic use, higher dose psychedelic use back in the 60s and 70s, and the birth of Silicon Valley. So that's kind of
a fascinating connection for you to make. And so there's no doubt in your mind that LSD in some part, or psychedelics more broadly, you tell me, in some part had a role to play in the Silicon Valley becoming the center of innovation that we now, and Stanford to that point, right?
Absolutely. I wouldn't say it's like the main, part of it, but it definitely played a facilitating role in that process, for sure.
That's fascinating. So, is there more you want to say about that part of it, Paul?
That's kind of like all I know. Well, I know a little bit more about the history, but I think, tracing it back to where we are now, we're noticing that a lot of these countercultural trends that were so relevant in the 60s, yoga, mindfulness meditation, psychedelics, even collective or communal living, a lot of those countercultural things are now becoming more mainstream culture in the here and now. So we're seeing the rise of yoga studios all over the place. Like my mom, who lives in suburban America in West Michigan, is now going to yoga. It's become totally mainstream. Mindfulness meditation, we're seeing the rise of it in like corporate work environments where a lot of people at Google, for example, are entering high-end retreats. And then, as part of that as well is psychedelics. Psychedelics are also what was once countercultural in the 60s is now become something that's mainstream and or becoming mainstream. And my approach, my belief is that microdosing is kind of sits at that avenue where it becomes this palpable way to try psychedelics without being intimidated by the potential of a bad trip or a challenging experience.
Yeah, so tell me about that. So if I were to microdose right now, and my understanding is when you microdose, you're taking a small amount of a hallucinogenic. Is it primarily LSD?
So LSD is the one that is getting a lot of the attention in the media because it is the most sensationalist, because there's a lot of negative kind of things associated with LSD use. But people are also doing it with psilocybin mushrooms. They're doing it with ayahuasca. They're doing it with iboga, a few other plant medicines as well.
Yeah, I have a friend who's gotten way into ayahuasca, and you're going to have to excuse me because I'm ignorant of this whole word. Is it ayahuasca ceremonies? Is that what they do?
Yeah, so like ayahuasca is a tea from the Amazon that is now being used in particularly in Brooklyn and San Francisco. And basically you'll have what they call medicine circles or ceremonies where you'll drink with the same people within some sort of ritual. And it's, again, I think it's a way to facilitate a healing process, a deepening of self-awareness, self-reflection, these sorts of things.
And so we sort of understand at least a little bit of the history. But for some of us, after the 70s, you sort of look at this stuff and you go, it seemed like it went away or certainly died down. And in the 80s, it became a cocaine thing, right? Drugs. And you didn't hear as much about hallucinogenics or I guess you call them psychedelics. Is that the term you'd prefer?
Psychedelics. Yeah, that's a term that I like to use because you don't really hallucinate on LSD. You just visuals, they kind of change in a way, but that's another.
Okay, well, you're gonna get me stoned in a sec. So you'll walk me through that experience. But so there seemed to look, and what do I know? There seemed to be psychedelics, at least from a mainstream point of view, were not as popular in the 80s, and Coke and that shit got really popular. And so when did this stuff come back? Or did it ever go away in the first place? And then how did it start to tip in the business and software development world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, like we kind of touched on earlier, that lineage of psychedelic use is really kept alive by the Grateful Dead through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, because pretty much in like I mentioned with Jim Fadiman's study in 1966, the LSD creativity problem solving study, Jim was actually facilitating that research, and he had just given the psychedelic to the 27 subjects that were sitting down, and he received a note from the federal government saying, hey, LSD is now illegal, you have to immediately seize all research. And so basically Jim was like, well, I just gave psychedelics to all these people, we're going to act like we got this letter tomorrow, put it aside, finish that day. And then from that point forward, all psychedelic research was illegal. So it really didn't come back until 1999, when you had a guy named Bob Jesse, who was he had an executive position at Oracle, the software company. And he teamed up with a guy named Roland Griffiths, who was a researcher who studied meditation at Johns Hopkins. And in 1999, they started the very first study on the relationship between psilocybin, magic mushrooms, high dose experiences, and initiating something called a mystical experience, which other people call, basically like a non-dual experience. And so that
a what, Paul? I'm sorry.
A non-dual experience. So
What's
like
a non-dual
basically
experience?
it's like the experience that people have when they go beyond time and space, when they experience that sense of selflessness, when a lot of spiritual people would say when they connected with God or the godhood, whatever it might be. And
so
psychedelics
to break out of my experience of the one that you and I are currently having, which is a time and space based experience, that I go and have this other experience. Is that
correct? Yeah. And so to contextualize that a little bit more is we have all these other things that also can initiate that: meditation, fasting, other rituals. But we know that or it can just happen sometimes spontaneously. But we know that psychedelics, the first research that came out, which was published in 2006, showed that psychedelics could initiate this experience on demand. And so since that point in time, a lot of the research then has tied that non-dual mystical experience with therapeutic benefits for addiction, depression, anxiety, PTSD, a number of things. So since that point in time now, we've had quite a bit of medical research that's shown the efficacy of psychedelics. And since that medical research is coming out more and more, there are more people who now feel like the conversation can evolve to not just keeping it within institutions like Johns Hopkins and NYU. There's also research going on in London and Imperial College. Now we can start to take these substances and use them within a improvement of overall well-being. And so instead of operating from, we need these substances and we can only treat them within a medical model, now you have people, particularly in Silicon Valley, getting back to the microdosing thing, who are interested in using it for peak performance, basically.
Okay, so let's see if we can unpack this. Let's forget microdosing for a second. If I just said to you, hey, Paul, I never tried LSD, and I just read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and I'm all frothed up. Let's get stoned together. Is that something you and I might do?
If I knew you pretty well, like if it was just a stranger who came up to me and was like, let's take psychedelics together, I'd be like, probably not. Because the psychedelics, they bring down your boundaries. You become very vulnerable when you're under the influence of them, which is why they can be somewhat dangerous if you don't pay attention to set and setting. So if someone were to come to me and say that, I'd be like, first, you need to make sure that you're taking it within an appropriate context. And also you need to make sure that you've cultivated.
So if I was about to get on a plane, this might be a bad idea. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah. And so that this kind of comes back to
I want to be in my house or in your house or somewhere where we feel safe and we know each other, and because some weird shit could go down. Is that, tell me what you're setting me up for if you were to create the conditions under which we would take psychedelics.
Yeah. So when you unpack, the psyche, which is what's going on when you take a psychedelic, you're really exposing very vulnerable parts of yourself, your subconscious, your unconscious. That puts you in a vulnerable position. So you want to make sure that the place that you take it is somewhere where you feel comfortable. So like when I took psychedelics back in the day, I often did it at my favorite like outdoor place where I would always go hiking, because I was always very comfortable with that, and I would do it with close friends. A lot of these therapeutic ways that they're doing it now with clinical research at NYU and Johns Hopkins, they do it in like a living room setting with a sofa that people lay down on, with really beautiful paintings, nice little music that comes on. So the aesthetic that they curate for the experience is very intentional, because
So
that was
and I need to be safe, because some weird shit could go down on this, or some vulnerable shit could go down on this.
Exactly. And so that was the whole issue in the 60s. That's why they became prohibited in the first place, was because you had the psychedelic evangelists like Timothy Leary, who were pretty much just handing out acid left and right like candy. And you had all these people who were tripping out in it in these public spaces, kind of just losing their minds.
Yeah.
And so there was no appropriate context for it, because from a Western culture perspective, we haven't utilized psychedelics for a couple thousand years. And that's an interesting part about psychedelics, is Plato used to do psychedelics. A lot of our foundational Western philosophy is actually influenced by the psychedelic experience. And so it's actually been a couple thousand years before, since we've actually utilized them in a Western culture and framework.
And so, okay, so we've set up this safe environment, and now you and I are going to go do this. Let's say we're not microdosing yet. We'll get to that in a second. Let's say we're doing it we're taking LSD in a more, let's call it, traditional way. Is that in a more Grateful Dead-esque way?
Yeah.
So let's say we're sitting in your living room or mine, and we take whatever you say is the right amount for a newbie to take, and we fire up a Grateful Dead live bootleg, and so then what happens? What do I feel? What do we experience together?
Yeah, so it's going to take about 30 to 45 minutes for the actual substance to start to take an effect. And what you'll notice is you just have a slight, feeling of euphoria that comes on. You'll probably be giggly, you'll be laughing. And then, as you start to go deeper and deeper into it, you're going to enter a state of oftentimes like deep reflection, self-reflection, and self-awareness. So a lot of times when people do these psychedelics, they don't have their eyes open. Instead, they'll wear like an eye shade, and they'll go deep into their inner self to start to kind of work through their past and issues that have happened to them before. So that's like the therapeutic way that it's used. However, it can also be used in like an outdoor setting, where basically, a central tenet of a high dose psychedelic experience is the sense of feeling interconnected with, trees, with friends, with, kind of like the hippie sort of vibe. Like, I just want to hug a tree. That's where it came from. Right. Because when you lower those boundaries of self, we usually operate in this very, individual ego perspective, where we perceive things outside of our individual self as other. When you take a psychedelic, you understand on a deep level that, in fact, it's not an other, that you are connected to that external thing that's outside yourself. And again, psychedelics don't just do this. Yoga, meditation, these other kind of tools that initiate non-dual states lower those boundaries of self, which then kind of create this sense of interconnectedness.
So it's interesting that you say that. I tried meditation as a young adult, and I tried it multiple times, and I've come to the conclusion that I'm the world's worst meditator, and so I don't do that shit. It's just a waste of my time. But the way the only way I know for me personally to access these, would you call them flow states? Is that fair, Paul?
Let's call them flow states. Yeah.
Okay.
That's helpful.
So these flow states is, for me, the way I get to them for the most part is in physical activities. So, living in Santa Cruz, I'm 2 blocks from the ocean, I surf all the time. And yesterday, for example, I had one of the best surf sessions I've had in 6 months. And when you catch an incredible wave, you are by definition in a flow state. And look, I'm not a great surfer. I'm an intermediate longboarder, but I'm a 6 foot guy. And when I'm on a wave and I can raise my hand up above me and I can't touch the top of the wave, I'm on a real fucking wave. And it lasts just seconds, of course, but it's a very, very alive, focused. There's no grocery list. There's no fucking whatever. There's no, as a matter of fact, there's no you. You go away for you. At least this is what happens for me. And I'm sure you've heard this expression. Surfers had created this term for what that feeling is like called stoke. And because happiness wasn't a good enough word, because stoke is a very particular feeling. And the interesting thing is, and I'm still feeling this from yesterday, the stoke occurs after the wave, in the moment you're in this flow state. And when you've had a great, at least for me, a great surf session, and other surfers I know describe it the same way, is that lighthearted, holy shit, to your point, connected, happy to be alive, thank you, Jesus, however you process that kind of a feeling, stays with you. You know, one great wave can stay with you for a week. And so it's not just the happiness of it, it's and I think that's why this word stoke is so cool, because, you know, you have stoke for some period of time. So is it like that?
That's the idea of it, is as you cultivate those states, and that can be done through extreme sports. So there's a really great book called Stealing Fire by a guy named Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel. And it's actually been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And he talks all about all of these stealing fire, all of these non-dual states, you know, whether that's through surfing or hang gliding, whether that's through microdosing, whether that's through meditation or fasting. You know, one of the examples he brings up in that book is Navy SEALs, how Navy SEALs will intentionally facilitate really intense training so that they bond as a group and they enter that group flow, so that when they're in the heart of battle, the way that they interact with each other is basically subconscious, meaning they don't have to think about it. It just happens automatically because they're able to initiate those states of group flow. So all of these are, you know, this example of selflessness. We get the you out of the way, that narrating self, that often, you know, that voice in the head that's responsible, I think, for a lot of just like issues in our world today, particularly mental health issues. We get that out of the way, and that allows us to be fully present in the moment to, you know, facilitate that feeling of stoke that you mentioned with surfing.
Interesting. So it's about a flow state, it's about presence, and it's about removing oneself, because at least for me, true flow and the presence of myself for myself, if I can say it that way, and that is to say my awareness of myself. If I'm aware of myself, I'm not in flow. That's for my personal experience. I'm no expert, but when we go away, and I think that's why surfing is so powerful, because and athletics for me is like that. And even a good run can do it, where you disappear for you, and you're in this. It sounds so much like I've lived on the West Coast for too long, but you're in a dance with the world, or in a dance with life, or in a dance with whatever the fuck you want to call it. You're not, you know, all of us, that voice in our head makes us self-conscious amongst so many other things. But there's the narrator in our head makes us always worried. Are we looking cool? Are we saying the right thing? Does Paul think I'm, you know, smart, or whatever the fuck that thing is talking to me about? And in those flow moments, there's no concern like, do I have snot on my nose, right? There's just this full-on presence with life. That's what we're talking about?
That's exactly what we're talking about. And there's like a sense of playfulness, or like a childlike spirit that comes in that. You know, like I often think back to like how I felt when I was 4, 5, and 6. You know, you didn't really have any cares in the world. You didn't really care if there was snot all over your face. You were just completely present in the world, enjoying what you were doing. And then oftentimes through, you know, teenage years, we create this personality, and we bring on kind of the stress of living in this industrialized world. And that I think facilitates the constant repetition of the narrating self. So now we're discovering that these modalities are really useful for not only then alleviating depression, addiction, anxiety, but also then reaching higher levels of peak performance to fully enjoy, you know, this experience that we have of being alive.
So now, Paul, maybe you could explain to me, if I sort of understand now a little bit about what it's like to take a full on, you know, quote unquote acid trip. So, okay, great. So I got that part, I think. This microdosing thing is very different from that, is it not?
In the moment, it is. So like when you take a high dose, you know, your visuals are changing. Your a lot of things are changing. You know, your sense of touch, your sense of smell, it's noticeable. The idea with a microdose is when you take it, it's sub-perceptible. So it's below the perceptible amount. And what happens is
when I microdose, I don't feel stoned. I'm not convening with Hunter S. Thompson when I microdose.
Exactly. From a visual perspective, it's sub-perceptible. Now, what people notice is when they microdose, they have slightly more energy. They're a little more creative. They're a little more empathetic. It's a little bit easier to meditate. And what then, you know, what we talk a lot about is with microdosing, it's less about the day of the experience, you know, day one when you're microdosing, and it's much more about what changes, tangible changes are you noticing from day 0 to day 90. Because like you said, you know, you went surfing yesterday, you experienced this feeling of stoke, and today it's still with you, that sense of presence. So the idea with, for example, a high dose psychedelic experience is we call it an afterglow, where you have this high dose experience, it's beautiful, and then for the next 3 or 4 days, it's a little bit easier to connect with other people, you're a little more present in the moment. For me, you know, when I was doing it, it's a little bit easier to focus on whatever I need to focus. I'm more disciplined about taking care of myself. But then after 3 or 4 days, that kind of goes away as you get back involved into the, you know, routine of everyday life. So the whole thing with microdosing is to extenuate that afterglow. So that instead of the afterglow just lasting 3 or 4 days, that afterglow effect might last for 2 months or 3 months.
Because you're taking do you call it a hit? Do you call it a bump? What do you call it?
A microdose of LSD.
A microdose, okay, because languaging matters, right? Okay, so, and if I did my homework right, is this right, that if you're getting into microdosing, you're probably microdosing every 4th day? Did I remember that right?
That's, you know, Jim Fadiman, the guy that I mentioned before, who's created this initial protocol. He's like, do it 2 times a week. Day 1, day 2 is off because you feel that afterglow a little bit. Day 3, completely off. Day 4, you do it again. And then day 5, day 6 is off. And then, you know, day 7, you might do it again. So it's between 2 and 3 times a week that people are typically microdosing with this.
And so if I was microdosing 2 or 3 times a week, what would be the benefits in my life?
Yeah, so what a lot of people are reporting is more energy, more creativity. Again, because when you're microdosing, you're initiating that flow state, basically on demand with the help of the microdose of LSD. So more creativity, easier access to flow states, an ability to connect with people a little bit easier. So, you know, I, throughout much of my high school and college days, really struggled with social anxiety because when I was in a social situation, I'm more introverted. I tend to be more introverted. And when I was in social situations, I was often in my head. And that narrating self was like, you know, pretty insecure about how I was interacting with other people.
So your inner monologue was saying shitty things to you about who you were being with other people.
Exactly. And then I noticed when I started to microdose, that voice went away. And I was able to be completely present with the person, again, entering that sort of dance that you mentioned in that moment when I was connecting with someone else.
So so in this case, microdosing allows that voice in your head, the voice we all have in our head, that's a running commentary, and for many of us, of course, myself included, can be very critical. Sometimes when I really presence that voice in my head, I notice, like, wow. If somebody else were to say to me the kinds of things that voice says to me, I'd probably punch him in the face, right? Like we can be incredibly horrible to ourselves, I have found. And so when one is microdosing, that voice goes away?
For me, that was the case. And That's not to say that this will be for everyone or that this is even immediate. But I think what it does is it puts you again into that state of flow. It puts you into that sense of selflessness. So over time, as you get used to that state more and more, you begin cultivating it even without the help of a microdose.
And if I start off, if I say, hey, this is my objective and I want to therefore start off microdosing, can I just microdose my way there? That is to say, sort of never get, if you will, kind of Hunter S. Thompson at like stoned and just microdose, or somewhere along the line do I actually have to say, hey, I'm actually gonna, maxi dose or whatever the fuck you call regular consumption of these substances to like have the full on Grateful Dead fear and loathing experience, or no, I could actually go through my whole life without getting my Hunter S. Thompson on and just take these small doses to improve my creativity, to improve my focus, to quiet the noise in my head, to feel more connected, etc.
Yeah, I think it just is like, it depends on what you're comfortable with. So some people, they have high levels of neurosis. They have a very strong ego, and that ego might be threatened by a high dose psychedelic experience because it's ego dissolution that you're going through. Whereas, other people might just say, hey,
slow you down, Paul. What? Ego dissolution? What's that?
Ego dissolution is another phrase of that sense of selflessness. It's we have this ego, this narrating self. When it's too rigid, when it's too present, that's when those voices, that narrating self is really present.
So when you're doing this stuff, are you having a lot of like, I love you, man moments? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, it's a sense of vulnerability. It's a sense of being able to connect, which I think, particularly with like men in American culture, Western culture, our inability to connect with other people is because we're afraid of that vulnerability and afraid of opening up and sharing. And I think this is, partly why psychedelics, particularly men in Silicon Valley, are becoming more and more interested in microdosing rather than modafinil or some of these other smart drugs that have been pretty prevalent.
Are those prescription drugs? What?
Modafinil, it's like something that's prescribed.
I thought you were saying like modaffodil, like it was some kind of a, hey, let me show you my modaffodil, like some kind of a hip hop plant or something.
It's like a prescription drug for like narcolepsy that a lot of nootropic enthusiasts are getting interested in for like productivity and concentration and things like that.
Fascinating. I find it so interesting that this stuff is mainstreaming now in a way that it never really did. I mean, if you go back in time, to the Grateful Dead era, you might posit that by the time you got to the 80s and 90s, this shit would be fully mainstream, and CEOs would be microdosing on their way to work in their limos and shit. But that didn't happen. There was, as we talked about a little bit earlier, there was this kind of lull. But now it's come back. Is it so? I have a theory as to why it's coming back, but I'm curious. What's your theory?
I mean, I could go at a very high level. I think from my perspective, the theory, a lot of the, why a lot of these modalities are coming back, psychedelics, but also yoga meditation, is because throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, we didn't know how to treat maladies of the mind, meaning that, more than ever, depression, anxiety, addiction is worse than it's ever been before. And through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the psychiatric field developed antidepressants, which now in recent research have been shown to be no more effective than placebos. So the reason a lot of these are coming back now
is credible information that prescribed antidepressants are no better than placebos.
So in research that they did, they showed that antidepressants were effective in 41% of the cases, and placebo was effective in 40% of the cases.
Wow.
And so the way that we treated the mind is we built models of how we could treat mental illness off of the gut. And so we had antibiotics in the 50s, the 40s and 50s that treated issues in the gut. We took a similar approach to the mind, and we're discovering more and more that these aren't working. for people. And so the reason a lot of these are coming back is because research into consciousness is beginning to explode. We want to understand what the mind means and what the mind's relationship is to healing the body and ourselves. That's my theory. That's my take. What's your take though? I want to hear your take.
So I think the millennial generation is much more focused on a lot of these kinds of topics, because my sense is, and I'm not a millennial, but my sense is the millennials looked at my generation and maybe even the generation of my parents and sort of said, hey, this kind of go, work 80 hours a week, bust my ass, only to retire at 65 and be miserable and die at 75 kind of doesn't look very cool to me. And so there's a search for meaning that is much deeper. Let me say it that way. The other thing I'd say is because the baby boomer generation, if you sort of say every generation, their philosophy is, hey, I want to give my kids a better opportunity than the opportunity I had. I think that very much appears to be a natural human desire. It makes total sense, right? So I think the baby boomers were able to give my generation, the Gen X generation, a tremendous amount like no generation before. And then the Gen X generation sort of tripled down on that shit with the millennial generation. And so I think what you have is a generation of younger people who, if you think about it from my Maslow hierarchy of needs perspective, they never had to worry about food. They got told they were awesome and loved and all that from day one. So they never got told they were assholes and losers the way some of us got told. Although, for the record, my parents never said that to me, but plenty of others did. Anyway, I digress. And so they've been surrounded with love and surrounded with food. And we live in a world where like nobody has to worry about, physical violence in a way that most of humanity has had to worry about that. And so I guess my point is when you get shelter, food, safety, and all those things basically handled, and in some cases handled for you, then all of a sudden you have this time. You don't have to struggle to kind of just make it. And so I think when you have time to think, then you start to think these, as on Saturday Night Live, Jack Handy used to call them deep thoughts, right? Like, who am I and how are we connected and what about this and what about that? And so I think that's a big part of it. I also think, it's interesting how for that the old expression, for everything there's an equal and opposite reaction. I'm sure, Paul, you've heard a lot about sort of the backlash against smartphones and Facebook and social networking and all that. And so there's a building body of research that, particularly for younger people, but I think it's probably true for a lot of people, that being always focused on social networks and therefore comparing myself to everybody else and having my nervous system always bombarded by, these weird bing, bing, bings when my email or like we just live in a constant world of technology distraction and these weird dopamine hits and then these weird disappointments because we like posted this photo of our fucking cat and we thought like 200 people were going to like it and only 4 did and all this weird shit.
Because Instagram withholds likes. Did you see that? Instagram purposely withholds likes so that people feel that they need to go back for that dopamine.
No, I didn't hear that. What's that about?
Well, basically Instagram had built their algorithm so that if you were, for example, maybe expecting 200 likes on your really cute cat photo, they would actually only show you initially maybe 20 likes so that you would keep going back to your Instagram and checking.
Even if you had 200, they would only show that you had 20?
Something like that, where they would withhold it in your interface so that you would feel that need to keep coming back. It's
those
really just
various dopamine distributors, those inauthentic, I want all my dopamine when it happens.
Yeah, it's exactly it. It's fucked. I read this article in The Atlantic maybe a few months ago about, I think the title of it was like, have smartphones destroyed an entire generation? Talking about how depression and anxiety and all these other things that you were mentioning are on the rise in younger generations because they're literally growing up since day one with a smartphone in their hand.
Well, and I also think, Paul, to your point, I think it's even worse in the entrepreneurial community. And the reason I believe that is today we have a lot of these self-proclaimed internet, entrepreneurial guru assholes. And some of these assholes talk about social media like it's an outcome in of itself. So like getting on Snapchat and quote unquote figuring out Snapchat, whatever the fuck that means, is like an important thing for an entrepreneur to go do. Well, I don't know, maybe, but a lot of that sounds like bullshit to me. Like your self-worth and the prospects of your company are not a function of how many fucking Twitter followers you have. Now, there may be, for some entrepreneurs, having a Twitter following can be important. So I'm not stupid about that. But to think that an entrepreneur needs to spend all this time with this self sort of aggrandizing or validation, I guess that's my point, that this need for self-validation every 15 seconds from the fucking selfie I just took with my cat is even worse from an entrepreneurial point of view, because there is nothing worth building that doesn't take some fucking time.
Yeah, this sense of instant gratification and needing instant gratification. There's a journalist from the UK, Will Storr, who wrote a book recently called Selfie, that like digs into this exact topic. And there was, I read an article in the New Yorker earlier this week about, are we just trying to optimize ourselves to death to some degree? And I think social media plays into that in terms of this comparative notion of, well, this person it's probably not even a friend, like this random acquaintance that I went to high school with is doing really cool shit. Well, now all of a sudden I feel like I need to do really cool shit. And I think then when we contextualize that within an entrepreneurial framework, we still live in a competitive business world. And particularly when you're an entrepreneur, you feel like you always need to be quote unquote hustling. And that for me is something that, tying this back into microdosing and flow states and everything, my whole thing is I don't want to be working more. I want to be doing the same amount I want to be as effective in less amount of time, meaning I much more seek out a proper work-life balance instead of just working myself into the ground, and doing 50, 60, 70-hour weeks. Because I think from my perspective, one of the reasons we're seeing the popularity of microdosing in places like Silicon Valley is because you have engineers, software engineers, founders, CEOs, executives who are working 60 to 70-hour weeks, which is making them miserable. And to basically cover that up, they're medicating with psychedelics, which naturally bring on some sense of glow and some sense of euphoria, so that at least for the short term while they're doing it, they feel better.
Yeah. And as a side note, I think hustle, the two biggest entrepreneurial pieces of advice we hear today are follow your passion and hustle. And both of them are fucking stupid. We talk about why if you like, but absolutely and damaging, really, really damaging advice. Because A, you follow your passion, you could take your passion and really fuck it up. And B, just working hard is not the answer. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't work hard. And I'm not suggesting there isn't value to hustle, but hustling in the context of what? Right. And so, and particularly if you're hustling in a category that's dominated by an existing company, you're fucked from the beginning anyway. But that's a different conversation. Now, I do want to sort of pivot a little bit, Paul, too. Okay, so when did you get your advanced medical degree again?
Exactly. So I don't have any sort of. I have like a bachelor's in.
You have a bachelor's in what?
History and business, like a double major. So
yeah, that prepares you to be an LSD online coach, I'm sure. And so I'm curious, one of the pushbacks, of course, you hear about this thing is, well, you're taking drugs, Paul. And now you're advocating that all these other people take drugs, and we don't know the long-term implications of that. So how do you think about that part?
Yeah, so I think kind of one point about that is, we do have a pretty clear understanding of the long-term implications of occasional psychedelic use. So, we know that every now and then, if you're doing psychedelics, it's perfectly safe as long as you don't have a family history of schizophrenia, psychosis, those sorts of things. But to kind of address the larger question of credentials, which I think is the kind of the question that you're getting at, is that's why I emphasize both in my public work, on my website, and other things, my background, and why what I'm talking about is not, although it's relevant to people who are struggling with medical conditions, the people who I'm personally working with do not come from that perspective. They come from the perspective of everything is pretty good, I just want things to get better. So I see myself more as a peak performance coach who utilizes microdosing as part of the holistic program, rather than, a psychedelic coach who's helping people to heal from past traumas and issues.
It reminds me, my Uncle John is a real character, and everybody has a crazy uncle. And by the way, I say crazy with a tremendous amount of love and respect, and I aspire to be the crazy uncle to the children in my life. So in that regard, my Uncle John is a model. Anyway, he has one of these great expressions where he says, "I know you're doing well, but you could always be doing a little better." And so you're not dealing with somebody who says, "Hey, I got all these monsters in my head. I was wondering if I should throw myself off the Golden Gate Bridge, and maybe I should. Maybe you could be my guru, Paul." That's not who you're talking to.
No, I think those cases are best handled by people who do have the credentials, whether that's therapists, psychiatrists, medical doctors. And so what I've built with the third wave is we get emails like that. And so we've built an ecosystem where I have people in my network who, if there is someone who comes to me with some sort of medical condition or issue, I can actually refer them to someone who has those credentials to help them. And I focus exclusively on people like myself who, they're more interested in that peak performance. So founders, software engineers, some of these people, types of people that we've been talking about before, and they're really looking at how they can utilize microdosing within a larger framework of holistic health and wellness.
And am I right in understanding, Paul, James, is it Fadiman? Is that how you properly pronounce his last name?
James Fadiman, yeah.
Fadiman. So he's a psychologist, yes?
Correct.
And has he not sort of anointed you as kind of the guy for this generation? Is that fair? I mean, I know you're not going to toot your own horn, maybe, but at least in Rolling Stone, he says you're the man.
Well, I'll tell you a story to help kind of clarify this. So Jim and I have been emailing back and forth for probably the past couple years now. Ever since I put up a first piece about microdosing, I created this kind of clever infographic by outsourcing it to a design team in Indonesia, something like that. And Jim saw it, sent me an email, and we went back and forth. And about a year later, I went to a conference in Oakland and went out to dinner with him. And
really, there was a conference in Oakland about this.
Not about microdosing, but about psychedelic science. It was called Psychedelic.
Exactly.
It was put on by MAPS. There were 3,200 people who came. And basically at that conference, Jim was like, "Hey, I see how things are going. Do you want to talk to media?" And then he introduced me to The Economist, to the New York Times, to Playboy, to a lot of these media outlets that then covered us in May, June, July. And so Jim was the one who basically spoke for me in that public sphere to facilitate that next step of what we're doing.
Now, one of the things I'm always fascinated by, of course, is how people position themselves for success and this notion of category design. That is to say, can we explain to the world who we are, the difference we make, and most importantly, in the context of a problem that matters to the world, such that we position ourselves effectively. And one of the things I find fascinating about you, and I don't know if you realize this, Paul, but when Rolling Stone calls you, quote, the world's first online LSD microdosing coach. What you have done is you have designed your own category, or if you will, created your own niche. And so, how did you position yourself as the world's first LSD microdosing coach?
So when I first came up with the idea of the third wave, I was in Budapest with two friends, and we were dropping acid. This is when I was first starting to microdose in like June 2015. And a guy that I was with was like, look, we're seeing, the rise of medical research. I really think, more and more people, he had lived in Silicon Valley for like 4 years. He's like, I really think more and more people are going to become interested in microdosing. And he says, what you should do is you should focus on, basically rebranding psychedelics through microdosing and become kind of the go-to person for people who are interested in utilizing psychedelics for, these peak performance perspectives. So that was like in June 2015. The article was published in September 2017. So within that time frame, what I was doing was just continuing to kind of cultivate that vision, so that it led to a point where, the Rolling Stone piece happened to come out. And kind of like what that looks like on a practical level is I was running another business at the time. I was, so like after I graduated from school, from college, I went and I lived in Turkey for a year where I taught English. And then I moved to Thailand, where I lived for a year, where I built my first kind of bootstrap business utilizing the framework that Tim Ferriss wrote about in 4-Hour Work Week. And so I had a lot of that coaching experience one-on-one. And so when I started the third wave to initiate some sort of initial revenue, I basically just put up like a little blurb on my website saying, hey, if you want to set up a 30-minute call to talk about microdosing things, it's X amount of dollars, let's do it. Because I had that prior experience with teaching English online. And then the journalist who wrote that Rolling Stone piece, she had written another piece for The Verge, which is, a major tech website. And while she was doing research for that, she saw my microdosing coaching thing. And because microdosing, there was a lot of like hoopla about it, microdosing for productivity, then microdosing for depression. Journalists are always looking for a new angle. So she picked that up, wrote me an email and was like, hey, should we do this piece? And I was like, this is kind of where I want it to go. So I was like, sure, let's do it.
But it sounds like, well, let me ask you, were you purposely, and if you thought about it differently, then tell me how you thought about it. It sounds like you were purposely positioning yourself to be the expert in this kind of field that you believed was emerging. So what was in your head, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, positioning myself less as an online microdosing coach and more as we could say, a public figure about the intersection of psychedelics and self-optimization, and particularly how that comes out within a changing business landscape.
It's so interesting because my dear friend Eddie Yoon, the author of an incredible book called Super Consumers, he helped me a lot with our book, and just an amazing guy. Anyway, he makes this distinction between missionaries and mercenaries. And he says, you got to ask yourself, which one are you? And it's very clear to me, having spent, my entire adult life in and around entrepreneurship, that there's just not a fucking chance you can be an entrepreneur if you're a mercenary. And so when I hear you say what you're saying is you made a decision to be a missionary. You wanted to stand at the front of this parade that you thought was going to happen. Is that right?
That's correct.
So why? Well, why is this your mission? Why?
Well, yeah, that's the $100 question. I think for a few reasons. One, I think these are important medicines and tools that, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, if people had a rational understanding and evaluation of them, that more people would be using them. And not only would more people be using them, but there would be a significant number of people whose lives would improve tangibly as a result of responsible psychedelic use. So I think my kind of the number one thing is I think they hold tremendous potential for improving the quality of life of people all over. And I think two, when I look at the contribution that I want to make with kind of the short lifetime, I want to do nothing short of just going for something really, really big that really aligns with, something that's been transformational in my own life. So when I was first doing psychedelics when I was 19 or 20, those were super profound and impactful in my own journey towards committing to like a more unconventional lifestyle. And so when I had the freedom and independence to publicly speak out about these substances, because I think that's one of the primary issues, is there's so much cultural stigma around psychedelics currently, where when people think of psychedelics, they think oftentimes of something negative. They think of just getting high, or hippies, or Hunter S. Thompson, kind of losing your head, whatever it might be. And I saw that there was a tremendous opportunity with the rise of medical research to rebrand and help people reperceive the way that they understand these substances, which I think will ideally contribute, and of course it all comes back to this for me, with understanding that we don't live within this individual ego, but that instead we are connected, we are interconnected to things outside of ourselves, to the other. And I think we're living at this point in time with the ecological crisis where it's more important than ever for people to understand that relationship as a way to build more sustainable regenerative systems, particularly in the business space.
And so you believe that microdosing helps people with that, correct me if I'm using the right words you want me to use, that interconnected experience of the world that you just described?
I think microdosing, like yoga, like meditation, like some of these other modalities, is a good first step towards actually not cognitively understanding these states of kind of non-dual awareness, but from like a heart perspective, really understanding them, really understanding on a deep level how we are connected to other things. I don't think microdosing is the end of the road. For me, microdosing leads to ideally, a breakthrough experience, what Maslow has called this peak experience. And that when more people undergo that peak experience, I think that will significantly change the way that we interact with one another. I think that will change the way that we interact with the world around us, with our communities, these sorts of things.
Now, wouldn't a skeptical or maybe even somebody who's against this idea say, well, why should you take fucking drugs to do this? Couldn't you just have this awesome, if you just got off your iPhone and looked at your wife in the eye and went out for a nice dinner and had a good conversation, like that we should be able to get here without the use of substances. How do you respond to that?
I say it's a tool in the toolbox. So basically, what that means is psychedelics are one way to get there. And because it's like rocket fuel, like jet fuel. So psychedelics can initiate this state, but with that also comes a much higher risk, which is why it's so important that they're done with an appropriate setting. So from my perspective, it's like you can get there with meditation. It's going to take you a year and a half, 2 years, but you can get there. You can probably get there with yoga as well. What you can do with psychedelics is, instead of it taking 6 months, 9 months, a year, you could get there within a week. And so that, for me, is what the potential holds for psychedelics. And I think particularly within our Western culture, there is somewhat of an ingrained sense of instant gratification. And so you have a lot of people who, if they were to go through this experience, they wouldn't have the patience to do so through meditation or fasting or yoga. They want something.
So this is enlightenment for the selfie generation. Is that what you're telling me?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, now we got what's really going on, right? Because I want to be like a yogi. I want to be like a monk. I want to be like a guru, and I don't want to put in the 30 years to get there. So fuck it, let's microdose.
That's That's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying.
Well, and look, that's either genius or, are you a Spinal Tap fan, Paul?
I'm not a, what's Spinal Tap?
Oh, God bless you. It's one of the greatest movies ever made. I think there's a handful of movies that if you watch, you don't really need to do much school. So Spinal Tap is this, it was the first faux music documentary. So this guy, Rob Reiner, did you ever see The Princess Bride?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Have you ever watched The Princess Bride when you're stoned?
Yeah,
it's a great movie. Anyway, the guy that made this movie, it's a documentary about a fake rock band that never existed, but they never tell you it's a fake documentary. And so when it first came out, they didn't promote that it was fake. And so a lot of people thought it was a real one. Anyway, long story longer than it needs to be. In Spinal Tap, at one point in the movie, there's a million great lines, but at one point in the movie, an interviewer asks, is having a conversation with the guitar player, and the guitar player says, "There's such a fine line between clever and stupid." Right? But and we've always known that. Einstein said there was a fine line between a genius and insanity. And so in 10 years from now, you will either be looked at as an insane person who is maybe even criminal, or a visionary category designer, pioneer, leader who opened us up to a way to get 30 years of enlightenment and guru-mint in maybe a few weeks of microdosing. I know which one you think you're going to be. So why do you think or let me ask it this way, 10 years from now, where are we with this whole, as you call it, third wave movement?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think 10 years from now, at that point, cannabis will be completely legal. I assume even at the federal level for the United States government. And I think that's one thing I didn't emphasize enough, but I think what is also responsible for the resurgence in psychedelics was first the reevaluation of cannabis. And I think that led the way then for reevaluating other illicit substances as well. So I think first, in 10 years, cannabis is completely legal at the federal level and likely in obviously all states. I think MDMA will be available particularly for veterans who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan to treat PTSD. You will have clinical settings. They're already doing this with ketamine, which is a dissociative. There are ketamine treatment clinics for depression. And you'll also have those for psilocybin mushrooms, where you'll have that to treat treatment-resistant depression, addiction, alcoholism, a lot of these things. You'll have clinical treatments. And I think in 10 years, then you'll also start to see initiatives passed where generally all drugs will be decriminalized. So a big part of what's going on right now in the United States is if you get caught with certain drugs that are not cannabis, alcohol, caffeine, or tobacco, you can go to jail. And I think what's going to happen more and more is like local townships did for cannabis, they decriminalized it. They're also going to decriminalize not only psychedelics, but I think generally all drug use, heroin, coke, a lot of these things.
You think that shit's going to get decriminalized over time?
I think so, yeah, because there are models now like Portugal has had all drugs have been decriminalized there, all drugs since 2000, and they did that in response to a heroin
including
epidemic.
Heroin. It's heroin, right? That's what caused Portugal to move.
That's correct. And I think with what's going on right now with the opiate crisis, I think it's the most rational response. Instead of treating...
Is decriminalization of all drugs.
Correct. Because instead of treating addiction like, a moral problem or issue, which we do in the United States, we treat it as a mental health issue. And we get people to support.
Well, and don't we also treat it as like and I think we probably do this with food too, as a willpower issue. Oh, well, if you're hooked on, I don't know, what's an opioid that people get hooked on? Vicodin?
Yeah.
I don't know much about this world. It's funny because when I first, I gave myself a severe back injury years ago, mountain biking. And as a result, I still have a horrible electrical wire that goes off in my leg from time to time. But anyways, I digress. So I remember having this back injury, Paul, and I was living in Tahoe at the time, and they prescribed for me, I think it was Vicodin. I don't know. It was one of these things, one of the opioids that everybody talks about that's highly addictive because it gets you really stoned and everybody. And so I'm like, me being me, I think, well, fucking A, I can't wait to get stoned on this awesome, and again, a Vicodin or whatever the fuck it was. And much to my chagrin, Paul, it did nothing for me. Like
Nothing.
no, it didn't. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it alleviated some of my pain. When I first got hurt and I was in the hospital, they shot me full of morphine, and that calmed down the screaming in my back and the leg for sure. They didn't give me morphine to take home, but they gave me whatever the opioid was. And I was so bummed that the opioid didn't do anything for me. And look, I'll happily admit this to you. I thought, okay, well, what if you chase it with a little bit of Jack Daniels or something, right? Maybe that'll like fire it up. Nothing. And so I have empathy for people who are hooked on these opioids. I don't want anybody to be hooked on these things, unless they want to be hooked on them, so to speak. But unfortunately for me, there was nothing to get hooked on, even when I tried a little.
Well, you're lucky. You're definitely one of the lucky ones. And so I think treating it like that, like that issue is important. But kind of back to the question, so Michael Pollan. Do you know who Michael Pollan is? Have you heard of him?
I don't, Paul. Please educate.
So he wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma about 10 years ago, which was a New York Times bestseller. And it took the locavore movement, how, we're going to go to local farms, source our, get the half cow, maybe get a chicken, a dozen eggs, cut out the grocery store. He took that movement, which was a subculture, and he blew it up into being something that's much more mainstream now, the locavore movement. Michael Pollan.
Sort of the farm to table movement is the phrase I've heard. Is that kind of thing? Yeah, like for example, we buy, I don't know what percentage, but I would tell you, Paul, and of course we live in a part of the world where buying from farmers is pretty easy because we, there's 3 farmers markets every week, one that I can ride my bike to very close to the house and 2 others that are short drives. So, we buy the vast majority of our meat from local farmers, and we buy virtually all of our produce that we don't grow ourselves because we have our own garden. But if for whatever reason we have to buy stuff from local as much as possible. And so he's a pioneer in that.
Well, when did you start doing that? I'm curious.
Well, me personally, I started doing that when I got serious with my girlfriend, now wife, Carrie. She grew up on a small orchard farm in San Jose. And so, I grew up in a small teeny weeny apartment in an urban environment. So I had no concept of any of this idea. And of course I grew up in Montreal, Canada. And so like fucking A, everything's frozen or everything got shipped in from, wherever. And so really for me, it's been in the last 10 years or so.
Right. And so Michael Pollan published that book in 2006. And that's when we started, Food Inc., the documentary came out in 2008. Anyway, the point that I'm making is Michael Pollan is publishing his next book about psychedelics, and it's coming out in May. And I expect that will do for the psychedelic movement, which is very much a subculture right now, and it will blow it up into the mainstream, just like Michael Pollan did for the farm to table movement when he wrote Omnivore's Dilemma in 2006.
Here's the other thing I wonder about, and if you think this is too far of a reach, then tell me. I think the internet might have a lot to do with this, because I've been thinking a lot about the internet the truth is I've been thinking a lot about the internet since I got my first CompuServe account, but I've been thinking a lot about the internet over the last year or so as I've become a podcaster, and it makes me think about it in a different way. This net neutrality discussion is a very important discussion. I think that for some reason is not being had at the level that I wish it was being had. But anyway, here's what I wonder. I think we are, 20 years almost into the mainstreaming of the internet. Netscape went public, if my memory's right, around 94-ish. And so I would say the internet got mainstream in the late 90s. And so I think what's going on is the democratization of thinking. That is to say, in the past, on scientific thinking or on societal thinking or business thinking or whatever, there were only so many outlets, right? If you wanted to read the latest thing in business, well, you got the Wall Street Journal, and maybe you read The Economist, and maybe you read Fortune magazine, and certainly you read the HBR. But, there were a handful, let's call them 10 in America, places where you went for substantive conversation about business. And, there were 3 news networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, forever and ever, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Well, now we live in a world, in the tech world, of course, we call it omni-channel, where a guy like you can have a podcast and begin to educate people about a thing that there's no fucking way when there was 10 or 15 business publications and when there were 3 major news networks, you wouldn't be able to exist, right?
So this gets back to my point that I made in the beginning. If psychedelics are at least somewhat responsible for the computer revolution in the 60s, which was obviously responsible for the decentralization of networks with the invention of the internet, then it's only fitting that they're coming back now because of this decentralization of the networks, and becoming more and more mainstream. Because like you said, and I'm going to tie this into psychedelics, the reason everyone is educated the way they are about psychedelics is because the federal government had, autonomy over the public school system. As we were growing up, we were educated in this way about, these drugs are fine, these drugs are bad. The government, there was that centralized structure. And then with the internet in the 90s, that really started to decentralize, which I think is what opened up the channels for more psychedelic research, which has then led us to where we are now, where, I can, like you said, I can have a podcast and start educating people about this, even though, my budget is, maybe $10,000 a month. And I started with, a handful of savings in my bank account.
Yeah. And now you become a trusted advisor in a way that maybe, some people wouldn't trust their doctor about this stuff. This is maybe go ahead, sir, go ahead.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I was just at a meeting the other day and there was a psychiatrist there, and he mentioned how in medical school that he was taught myths about LSD that the medical school was teaching as facts. So like one big myth about LSD is that it gets stuck in your spine, which is a complete myth. That doesn't happen. But the psychiatrist who went to medical school was taught the wrong, incorrect information. So you have all these medical professionals who are who not only don't know a lot about psychedelics, but they're actually misinformed about them, which means that people who want answers that are true, that are factual, need to go other routes to be able to get that information, one of which we provide.
Yeah, and we now also know, of course, that for decades, at least in the United States, the amount of known misinformation about cannabis that was perpetuated, it was extraordinary. I mean, out and out lies not supported by research and just got parroted off and on, on and on. We're now learning the same thing about a lot of what we thought was right about food, right? It's like egg white omelets. Well, fucking A. I guess where most of the value is in an egg.
The yolk.
It's the fucking yolk. And don't tell me it's bad cholesterol. We all know that's not true. And I know that was true for a long time, just based on how my body felt. Right. And so, and that's a teeny weeny little example, but there's so much about our diet now that we know, we know all this stuff about, well, we want fat in our diet and that it's carbohydrates, all the stuff that essentially the food pyramid that we got taught when I was a kid is completely fucking upside down backwards. Right. We know that now. And yet a lot of those things persist and on and on and on. And so, I find cool about that. I'll give you a simple example. This may sound crazy to you, but, I have, my wife and I have 6 hens. It might sound crazy to the LSD expert here. And so we love these hens. They're wonderful. They're like our pets. They come in the house and all this stuff. And so when this movement is called the quote backyard chicken movement. And there's a Paul.
Like an acronym? Do you have like an acronym for that? Like the
I guess it's just called the I guess. I think the acronym's just called Cluck Cluck or something.
Okay.
But the gal who is the Paul Austin of that world, I actually don't even know her name. I could look it up. She markets herself online and hugely successfully on Facebook as quote unquote the chicken chick. And yeah, you should friend her on Facebook. She's fucking awesome. The chicken chick. She goes live all the time. She posts all these. She posts all these photos. She has one of her favorite chickens that has this great feathers. Her name is Rachel, and so she posts the daily Rachel, and she's incredible. And so she's like, she's the PewDiePie of the chicken world, so to speak, right? She is the category queen. She is the Dear Abby of advice and knowledge and inspiration and motivation for people like myself who are in the backyard chickening world. And just like you, she's not a vet. And so there's this fascinating thing where with the internet democratizing distribution of information, that someone with a passion for something who becomes self-educated can all of a sudden wake up one day and be a guru and make, in her case, a living being the chicken chick. And so, yeah, you're the chicken chick of LSD, I guess.
Well, that speaks to like how all these centralized institutions, they're just not adaptable enough. And how like academia even is on the decline, because what was relevant a year ago might not be relevant today. Because as we learn more and more information, we're learning that a lot of the things that we previously thought were correct are actually not. So those who are leaders, I think, within whether these small sub niches or generally, leadership is about adaptability, which of course that's what microdosing does, is it makes you more adaptable.
So, as someone who's never done this before, Paul, and, look, I don't know whether I ever will or not. So I may remain a
spectator.
A spectator. There you go. That's a good word for it. I may remain a spectator for the balance of my time on planet Earth, or maybe not. I don't know. I'm not against it. I have no, to your point earlier on the moral stuff, I have what I think a lot of people would call a very libertarian view about this, which is, hey, if you're not hurting anyone else, then fucking do whatever you want. I don't really care. And we also live in a world where we don't penalize people for doing things that are bad for themselves down the road, right? If I overeat and then get sick and need a lot of medical care, well, our society doesn't say, well, just because you ate too much, we're not going to take care of you. We do. So look, I have no idea what the long-term impact of this stuff is, but my point is I have no value judgment about it, and I may very well stay on the sidelines. Now, all that said, let's say I were to call you and say, hey, Paul, I'm curious, I want to do this. How would one get started microdosing?
So like, how does one source, or are you more questioning like what is...
I remember when I became a backcountry skier, when I first started to do that, I got introduced to it by my dear friend, Tim Rode. And what I realized is he was setting me up with the gear and taking me out on the initial run. The initial beginning of it was, if I didn't have a friend like Tim, there's no way to recreate this. Maybe I could have hired somebody to really, but like, you need a lot of help when you're going to go and you're going to deal with avalanches, and you need to get your training, and you need to understand what skins are for there's just a lot of shit you need to learn. And if you don't have a friend, it was the same thing for me when I first started surfing. If you don't have a good friend who's willing to hold your hand for some period of time, this could not go well. And so, yeah, I guess from the whole thing, I'm not somebody who would know where to fucking start. So if I said, you know what, this sounds cool, but it's scary, and I don't want to ruin my brain because I like my brain, but I want to try this. Yeah, the whole thing. How does one start?
Yeah, so I think that, the first thing is you obviously have to get the substance. So typically people are microdosing with LSD or psilocybin mushrooms. I won't go into those details because those are illegal substances. Some people will get them from Canada. Some people will go on the dark web. Some people will contact a friend. So
if it's from Canada, it must be great, eh?
That's right. In a laboratory, made in a laboratory.
Is this shit legal in Canada?
So there's an analog called 1P LSD, which is just slightly different than regular LSD, which was invented in 2014, which you can legally purchase in Canada. And it does the same thing as regular LSD, but because it's a new analog, there's no really law around it in Canada specifically.
So that's like so crafty.
Yeah, they are crafty. Like that's the first thing, and I think
okay. So you got to get it. How do I know? How do I know that I didn't get something cooked up by some maniac that's going to blow my brain out versus whatever the good shit is?
Yeah, so you need to test your drugs as well. So LSD it's non-toxic. So no one has ever died physiologically from taking LSD. You could take, 1,000 doses, drink a, snort a line of LSD and you won't die. You'll have a very intense psychedelic trip, but it's not toxic. It's also not addictive. So you can't become physiologically addicted to LSD, unlike other drugs. And so, however, there are substances that people will pass off as LSD that are toxic. And so that's why it's really important to always test it. So you can just buy, like, I think on our website, we have drug testing kits. And that's a really simple sort of test to make sure.
I thought the best way to test it would be to ask your buddy Jim to try it first and see what happens to him.
Yeah, and if he just doesn't like resurface for a day or so, then something's up. Totally.
Yeah. So you actually want to make sure you got the good shit, and I can buy off of your website an LSD testing kit that tells me whether this is the good shit or not.
Yeah, and we actually have like full microdosing kits that come without the microdose. So it has the testing kit, and it has then specifically for LSD, what you're going to do typically is dissolve it in distilled water. And so that it comes with like a bottle of distilled water, a little syringe so you can measure it out, because a big part of microdosing is making sure that you're doing it accurately. And so when you're microdosing with LSD, for example, you usually want to take like 10 micrograms of LSD. A full kind of dose is typically 100 micrograms. So if you have one dose, you put it in 100 milliliters of distilled water, not regular water, because the minerals in regular water will affect the chemical composition. But distilled water, so 100 micrograms and 100 milliliters of distilled water. And that way, for every 1 milliliter of distilled water, you're taking 1 microgram of LSD.
And excuse my complete ignorance, but are you puffing this stuff, or are you squirting it down your throat or drinking it, or how do you get it in you?
Yeah, so that's why we have something like a little syringe, not with a needle or anything. It's just a little syringe that you can withdraw the water with. So that if you're withdrawing the water, it's 10 milliliters, and then you squirt it in your mouth, you're getting 10 micrograms of LSD.
So you just squirt it down your throat, or do you squirt it under your tongue, or
just squirt it down your throat? Generally, it's pretty straightforward. And what that does is it makes sure that you're taking the right amount, because I think one of the biggest issues or concerns that people have who want to start microdosing is, what if I take too much? So I've come up with this, clever turn of phrase, which is start low and go slow, meaning that like you want to start with a very low amount, which is usually 5 to 10 micrograms of LSD. And you want to, when you do it the first time, you want to do it almost like you're taking a full dose. So do it in your comfortable apartment in a setting that you're really, okay with, and just have a day off where you're not going to work. You don't have any really commitments or responsibilities, and you can see how it's impacting, your experience.
So this reminds me of the cannabis edible mantra you hear, which is that you can always be more stoned, but you can't be less stoned.
I like that.
Yeah. And
I like that. Yeah.
A quick story about that. So the names will remain disguised to protect the innocent. But a friend of mine has elderly parents. Elderly parents have rickety shit going on that causes pain, that impedes sleep. If you live long enough, you get some shit going on, right? It just happens in life. So in this situation, parents get edible cannabis, are told explicitly, hey, you can always be more stoned, but you can't be less stoned. Take a teeny weeny little bit of this, wait an hour, see what happens. Well, guess what? Grandma took too much cannabis.
Oh, no.
And grandpa calls and says, hey, grandma's kind of freaking out on the bed. Should we dial 911? And friend has to explain to parents, no, just give mom some Doritos and grandma will feel a lot better. So a similar thing, I guess, is what you're saying.
It's a similar thing. You don't want to take too much, especially if, it's someone who never has done psychedelics before, because this will be a completely new sort of experience. So it's really good to start low. And with mushrooms, it's usually about 1/10 of a regular dose. So you're looking at anywhere from 0.2 grams to 0.4 0.5 grams.
And so if I'm microdosing properly, I never have a psychoactive experience of being stoned. Is that what's going on?
That's correct. What you'll notice is you're just a little more alert, a little more energetic, like we talked about earlier, a little more, you might have a little more creativity. It's easier to connect with other people, but you're not going to feel like I'm really on LSD. Like this is some serious shit. It'll be very sub-perceptible.
Okay. And to close the loop, if I was going to try this, I need to do some testing to make sure I got the good shit, not the bad shit. And then B, from a dosing perspective, I need to do the concoction properly, particularly Correct. If I don't want to have any kind of a psychoactive stone-like experience.
Correct. And we have all of that, material again on our website where we have long form articles about all the specific technicalities of that if people just want as a reference point to go to that as well.
Got it. Well, Paul, this is a fascinating discussion. And I find it interesting. Look, I don't know, candidly, to be totally candid with you, I don't know whether you're a genius or whether you're evil or what the fuck you are. But here's what I do know. One of my favorite quotes is, if you haven't changed your mind lately, how do you know you have one? And as I've gotten older, I find myself actually less rigid in thinking and positions than more rigid. So look, I have no idea whether this is a great idea or a horrible idea, but it's a fascinating idea, particularly as I've seen the rise of this stuff in the entrepreneurial community and in Silicon Valley. Anyway, so I can't thank you enough for investing some of your life with me. I'm curious, before we wrap here, Paul, anything else you want to touch on?
No, I think that does it. I had it's past hour and a half or so. It was great. It was a ton of fun. I haven't really done a podcast interview like this before. So usually when I've done them, it's been with psychedelic people. So this is like a really good opportunity to speak to someone like you said, you've never done psychedelics before. So I had a great time. So thanks for having me on.
Well, Paul, and the other thing I find cool is I really admire your willingness to stand for something you believe in, whether I believe in it or not. And again, I don't have anything, I'm not for or against, I don't know. This is a learning experience for me. But all that said, what I do know is it takes a lot of courage to stand up and say, I believe in this thing. It's counter what most people believe. I'm gonna bet my future on it, and I'm gonna be the guy that designs this new category of thinking. Whether I don't know how to judge what you're doing or not, but what I do know is that part of it, I get that you're coming from a good place. So I get that part. And I deeply get the courage it takes to step out, particularly on a controversial topic like this, and try to be the guy, try to be the category designer that brings it to the world and to the mainstream. And so for that and for spending time with me today, Paul, I thank you so much.
Well, I just want to thank you again, and thank you for saying that. It's reassuring to hear that, because it is a difficult road at times because of how controversial the topic is. But at the same time, I do believe that we're on the right side of history, so to say, and that's obviously what keeps me motivated.
Well, and the other thing, this is an interesting one. I don't think you have to be an advocate for an idea to be willing to explore it. Right. So I don't know whether I'm pro microdosing or anti microdosing or neutral. I don't fucking know. I don't know anything about it. But what I do know is it's happening in the world, and it's happening at some level of scale, and it is a emerging category. And so I really appreciate, and so I think it's important for all of us to get educated. And I really appreciate you taking the time to educate me.
Yeah, totally. I had a great time. So thanks again, Chris. This was a ton of fun.
Awesome. Be legendary, my friend.
Whoo! How's that conversation? Eye-opener, huh? Well, if one of our objectives is to have authentic conversations that make you think about what it takes to design a legendary business and a legendary life, now we all got to think about, should we or shouldn't we be LSD microdosing? If you know somebody who would love this episode of Legends and Losers, why not email it with them right now? And we would love you just a little bit extra if you shared it on social media, because we know this episode will literally blow people's minds. And we'd love you to check out legendsandlosers.com. And if you would like to be part of the street team to help us with the launch of Heather Clancy and my new book called Niche Down, send an email to blackhole@legendsandlosers.com, subject Niche Down, and we will email you for free, gratis, completely gratis, the first chapter of Niche Down. And in exchange, if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. And we'll let you know when the book is coming out. We would love your support to help promote the book through all sorts of digital channels. So if you'd like to be part of the Niche Down Street team and help Heather Clancy and I deliver what we hope is a legendary book, please send email to blackhole, all one word, @legendsandlosers.com, subject Niche Down, and we'll get you a copy of Chapter 1. All right. We would like to thank the amazing new book, Unscaled, from Kevin Maney, our guest on episode 136, How AI and a New Generation of Upstarts is Creating the Economy of the Future. HarperCollins Instant Classic, Play Bigger, How Pirates, Dreamers, and Innovators Create and Dominate Markets. Why not pick up a copy wherever you buy legendary books today? Equity Directory. If you're in the startup ecosystem, check out equitydirectory.com. This is the place where startups and talent who work with startups meet. Check them out, equitydirectory.com. One Life Fully Lived. We are a nonprofit helping you dream, plan, and live your best life. Check out onelifefullylived.org. Interviewvalet.com. If you're a thought leader, you're an executive, you're an author, you're a speaker, and you want to get your leading thoughts on leading podcasts, interviewvalet.com specializes in podcast interview marketing. Check them out. Pursuingresults.com. They produce legendary podcasts, and every once in a while, they even produce this one. Check out pursuingresults.com. Our good friends at Verve Coffee. You have not had West Coast artisan coffee until you've had Verve Coffee in Santa Cruz, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Tokyo, and always at vervecoffee.com. Category Design Advisors. If you want to design and dominate your niche, check out categorydesignadvisors.com. A podcast I love with my friend, the nicest man in podcasting, Jamie J. Stop Riding the Pine. If you're an entrepreneur, this is your podcast. Stop Riding the Pine. And a book that I think is amazing. Bill Walton's Back from the Dead. Bill was our guest on episode 126, and his book will make you feel better about life. Check out the amazing book, Back from the Dead. All right. We would like to remind you that this oddcast is the sole property of the Legends and Losers Oddcast Network, and we would love you just a little extra if you shared the shit out of it. Now, all rights do remain disturbed. We must warn you that this oddcast is clearly produced in a studio that does contain nuts. Teach technology. There's no such thing as a participation award. Chill your nuts, listen to the Ramones, don't be lame, get out of the passing lane, go ahead, it's okay, you can pee in your wetsuit, and thank you, Dandy Candy, love you, Mom and Dad, and hey, Colin, this oddcast really ties the room together, doesn't it? Today, our deepest apologies go out to Bill McDermott, Chief Executive of SAP. Sorry, Billy, we just ran out of time for you. That's it, my friends. Thank you so much for hanging out with us on this episode of Legends and Losers, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.